Greetings, friends, and welcome to Breakfast in the Ruins, a Michael Moorcock flavoured podcast. On this show, I'm finally joined by Simon Perrins. Simon is an artist, illustrator, an all-round top fella whose work you'll recognise as he's behind the visual identity of this podcast. And if you're a follower of the Grognard Files, you'll also recognise his extensive work for the Grog Meets of the last couple of years, may even have the t-shirt. We cover a lot of ground, from a starting base of the artists that have graced the covers of Moorcock's work and interpreted his characters for comics and graphic novels. Actually, we cover a lot of ground before we even hit that base. It's always a challenge for a podcast talking about visual stimulation via an audio medium, but I'll pop pics in the show notes on the Patreon page and the blog at breakfastintheruins.com as an accompaniment or reference. Also, for those listeners that tune in on YouTube, we'll stick some images in the video file, although that might take a bit longer to appear, as I forgot to tie them to a timestamp when I was gathering them. Fortunately, as is de rigueur for Breakfast in the Ruins, we also head down various rabbit holes not so strictly art-focused. We've had lots of engagement from the Moonbeam Roads community in the last couple of weeks, and we'll take a look at some of that in the outro. But for now, join us in Derry and Toms as we discuss Moorcock, art, comics, Tolkien, TV adaptations, role-playing games, tortured poet-musicians we adored in our youths, and some other guff. We're back at Derry and Toms, and we have with us Simon Perrins. Hello, Simon.
Hi.
And welcome to Derry and Toms. We've been talking about doing this for absolutely ages.
It feels like about 2 years, doesn't it?
I think it probably is about 2 years.
Yeah.
But for one reason or another, we've never kind of made it happen. So at the weekend, I just dropped you a line and said, let's just do Tuesday night and wing it. So we're whilst we might have a slight set of mental notes on where the conversation might go, which always tends to break down on this anyway, and we end up going off on wild tangents, we just decided, fuck it, let's do it. So it's great to have you here. And not only that, but you are such a core part of this show's identity. It's really absolutely shameful on my part that we haven't made this happen sooner.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've been talking to like proper people, people with perhaps something more to say than me. I don't think you're going to get any scintillating literary analysis from me. I'll just talk about pretty pictures and how cool dragons and swords and things are.
And you know what? That is the purpose of this. And you're an artist. You know what you're talking about. Somebody mentioned on Twitter today, somebody made it was Miles made a comment about the character of Ryan in The Black Corridor. And it was a really astute observation. Whereas all I said all the way through The Black Corridor was, wow, what a prick this guy is. Fuck that bloke. So I rely on people who know what they're talking about to actually, make the show a little bit more erudite and enlightened. And from an art perspective, you are very much that. So I suppose going back a little bit, the first time we came across each other was just being part of the same RPG community on Twitter, to all intents and purposes, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I realised you were an artist. You were at Thought Bubble that year, and I went to Thought Bubble that year, and we caught up, had a conversation, and I commissioned a sketch off you, and a few weeks later you sent me a sketch of 3 of the companions to the champion, which were Rakia the Red Archer, Moonglum, and Jari Arconel. And I was absolutely blown away by the picture, blown away by the style. I think at this point, we should probably point out that we're going to be talking about art and interpretations of Moorcock on an audio on an audio medium.
The ideal forum
to
talk about visual material, just describe stuff.
Yeah. But I was thinking perhaps, I do remember when I first put an episode of this on YouTube, before I realised that Podbean would actually automate it for you. So, like a clown, I spent absolutely ages buggering about with a video suite to try and turn an audio file into something that had, occasional visuals. It was very poor and very primitive. But perhaps we could do something like that for this. So when we actually are talking about a specific picture or a specific artist, maybe we can throw some visuals up which actually show that what we're talking about. And also, I'll put it in the show notes as well, or in a 47-mile long Twitter thread to accompany the show.
I find so often when I'm listening to podcasts, I feel the need to Google what people are talking about. I mean, often with Breakfast in the Ruins, you're talking about a particular cover, and I'm like, is that one I know? And I look it up. But I think it's also going to be fun to just describe stuff, and your listeners can see if they can make head or tail of what we're talking about, and then we give them the links.
Yeah, I think that's a fair approach. And in some ways, we should probably point out this is going to be a two-stage conversation, because I'm sure we'll get into comic art interpretations of some of Moorcock's stuff as well. But we were talking a couple of weeks ago about an 80s comic, an independent comic, published by, who published this? Trident Comics in the UK, called Saga of the Man-Elf. It was a 5-issue run written by Guy Lawley, and the first couple of comics were drawn by Steve Whitaker. And Michael Moorcock actually wrote an introduction to it and allowed them to use characters from his Jerry Cornelius novels in the comic. So we were having a quick conversation about that, and I thought, I wonder if it's possible to get hold of this Guy Lawley fella. So I had a good search around the internet and couldn't find anything else that he'd done in terms of comic art. But I did find a Guy Lawley who was a professor working at a university and lecturing in the field of things like comics and comic art. I thought, well, that's a coincidence. So I emailed him at his academic email account and said, I'm just wondering, Guy, if you are the guy who wrote Saga of the Man-Elf. And he came back about a week later saying, oh, yeah, that's me. And I haven't thought about that for quite a long time. It seems like ages ago, of course, it was the early 80s. And I dropped him a line again to say, would you be interested on coming on the podcast to talk not only about your work on Saga of the Man-Elf, but the work you do more broadly? And rather wonderfully, he said yes. So we're not going to talk anymore about the Saga of the Man-Elf right now, but what I am going to do is reread them. I'm going to post them to you so you can read them. And then we're going to drop Guy a line, and we're going to get him on the show, and the three of us are going to have a conversation, and that'll form the second half of this episode. So that's quite cool. It's something to look forward to.
I believe he's going to have a reread of them himself, isn't he?
Yeah. So that's really exciting, because I've had these kicking around on the shelf in a plastic bag for years, and always wondered about the history of them and why they were written and by whom. So that's going to be really cool. But this is your first time on the show. And whilst I've got a few random wing it questions for you, one of which is Marillion related, we always ask new guests, what's your history with Moorcock?
Okay, well, I thought you'd ask me that. And I've been trying to think, and it's tricky because I don't remember exactly when it was. I think, like a lot of your listeners and a lot of the people we interact with on Twitter, your sort of love of Moorcock is tied in with your love of gaming. And like with me, I came to those things absolutely at the same time. And, I was a subscriber to White Dwarf, and my very first issue of White Dwarf was number 57. And I don't know if you remember issue 57, but that was the issue where Thrud the Barbarian met Eric of Boney Maloney.
Yeah, Boney Maloney.
And at the time, I'd never read any Moorcock, but somehow I got it. I sort of understood what it was getting at. So I must have read about Moorcock. I think in either like an introduction to Dungeons and Dragons or Dicing with Dragons by Ian Livingstone, because they would always have the same. They would always start with, this comes from Tolkien, it comes from Jack Vance, it comes from Fritz Lieber, it comes from Michael Moorcock. So I must have known something about Elric, and I must have just had a vague impression that there was this, albino warrior who was a bit emo. I mean, we wouldn't have said emo back then, but that was definitely the vibe that was going on.
He invented emo.
Exactly, yeah. But getting into gaming, I was really into the fighting fantasy game books, like most British people of a certain vintage who were into gaming. And I got to what I thought was the last fighting fantasy book, which I think was number 9. you know, unsuspecting that there'd be like 50 more
Yeah.
down the line. And I thought, oh well, now it's time for me to start reading not like fantasy novels, you know. And I think I read The Hobbit, and I started reading Lord of the Rings. I think that took like 2 years. But I went to my local library, and they had Elric and Melniboné, The Eternal Champion, and The Warhound and the World's Pain. So they were the first three Moorcock books that I read. And this must have been very, very soon after I read that White Dwarf with Thrud, because from that I read as many Elric books as I could, and then started reading the Corran books. I think the next one after those three I read was The Knight of the Swords, and my little group of gaming friends who were all into Moorcock as well. So we were all buying the books and sort of lending them to each other, and sort of working my way through, definitely the Eternal Champion, the core four.
Yeah.
And, obviously looking back now, there's been so many Elric books since then, but there were only 6 or 7 then. And, the first one wasn't being published by Grafton. That sort of came later. And, there were a couple of others that were sort of hard to get hold of. I think Stormbringer I couldn't get hold of that for quite a while, but yeah, and from there, just sort of explored the universe, and again, not long after that, Imagine Magazine did their Michael Moorcock special, which I've got,
of course,
here.
This is that the Rodney Matthews cover as well?
Yeah. And Jez Goodwin are inside. And that this is not the copy I had at the time. That's long gone, but I got this on eBay maybe 10, 15 years ago. And there was an interview with Moorcock. There was like an introduction to his world. So I was reading that after reading a couple of Elric stories and maybe The Eternal Champion, and starting to kind of get an impression that there was this whole universal multiverse and how these characters interrelated. And that sort of made sense to me. I guess I'd been into science fiction and things. I understood the concept of parallel worlds and stuff, but this idea that this same character was kind of recurring throughout these different universes, and living out the same story but in a different way, that I found that really compelling. And of course later on played Stormbringer. Really got into Stormbringer and played that a lot. So yeah, that's pretty much my Moorcock origin.
Yeah, there's something super exciting in those days, wasn't there, about picking up another book about another aspect of the Eternal Champion and making a connection and recognizing a reference, or having a character pop up. The idea of a shared universe, which we now take for granted with things like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and really what people are experiencing now, watching She-Hulk and Wong turning up, is exactly what used to happen when you were reading Michael Moorcock books in the 70s and 80s. It was the equivalent of that, and there was nothing else like it. It was fantastic.
Yeah, but there was the whole thing of you don't necessarily start out thinking that these characters are all part of the same milieu. Like you originally picking up Hawkmoon, it's like, well, it's a completely different world. It's a similar fantasy book, and obviously this is a guy who's writing a lot of different fantasy books, but like it was that moment of excitement when it's like, oh, now it's starting to kind of tie into the bigger story, and you see the themes and those sorts of things.
I remember reading one of the Dances at the End of Time books, and Oswald Bastable and Una Persson turn up, and it blew my mind. It absolutely blew my mind. I was like, what's going on?
Yeah.
This is amazing. And I think I probably said it before, but on some levels, I do wonder if Moorcock did all this out of design. I'm sure there was an element of design to it, but I also wonder if there was an element of laziness to it as well. And just having constant crossovers and constantly kind of recycling and regenerating. But it works, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's super exciting.
Yeah. He can't have been thinking that his books would, go on to be read many, many years down the line, because he was writing a lot of them so quickly, and some of them were short stories and appearing in magazines, and he must have just been kind of churning this stuff out and coming up with so many ideas, and to sort of later down the line sort of try and tie it together. I mean, I remember like the Eternal Champion, I always had the impression that was the first one he wrote, just because it seemed to be like the keystone of everything. And I had no idea the order that all these books had originally been written. I really, really got the impression that was the first one. Then it was Elric, and then it was Corum, and then Hawkmoon Last, because I read Hawkmoon Last. But it's all. I mean, a lot of them were being done at the same time, right? A lot of the Hawkmoon and Elric books. I think.
And when it comes to Elric, certainly, actually, of course, we've just got Citadel of Forgotten Myths releasing in December. And the makeup of the early Elric novels were novellas kit bashed together that were written a lot earlier. So he was writing Elric novellas in the early 60s, and then he would kit bash them later into novels. And I think anybody who pops up and thinks that Citadel of Forgotten Myths that releases in December is disappointing, because it's the first two books are republished novellas written in the last 10, 15 years, doesn't understand the history of Elric novels, because that's exactly how they came about in the first place. And it is absolutely on brand for Moorcock to do that, to revise a couple of novellas and weave them into something larger. It's part of his pattern.
I mean, I think the wonderful thing about Moorcock is, the stuff that drives Tolkien fans crazy is, well, what is canon? Because he wrote this thing and it slightly contradicts this thing. And, obviously with the Star Wars universe, you have all this expanded universe, all this fiction. Some of it is being contradicted. And some, while, the Marvel comics contradicted the novels, and well, which is the real one? And the real one is always the one you read first, the one you like the best. But with Moorcock doing a version of a story that he's done before, and like changing the details, like the I think it's the Jade Man's Eyes that he rewrote. It absolutely works, because there's infinite versions of these universes. He can go back and he can change his books and republish them as much as he wants, and it absolutely fits. And it's one of the few instances where these things do fit. You know.
I think you can also go back and read the unrevised versions, and they feel just as legitimate to me. Possibly because I read them first. I don't know. I don't think I'll ever forgive him for rewriting Elric's Clobber for the 60th anniversary edition of the Dreaming City, but everything else I can forgive him for. There are silly little things like Scout Leader Reagan being rebadged Scout Leader Egan in the American edition of Warlord of the Air, which crept over into a Grafton edition that I had. I think I put it in a tiny library down the road. There's a tiny library down the road. So I was wanting to stick it in there, hoping that some 13-year-old kid will pick it up. It's like the Melvin airship cover on the front. And I think they're just as legitimate when you go back and reread them. But strangely, you just mentioned Tolkien, and Tolkien's never too far away when we're talking about Moorcock for one reason or another. But I was thinking about that the other day. There's a lot of people really upset, for example, about Rings of Power. And okay, Mithrilla's elf juice. I'm not quite on board with that. But most of the rest of it, fine, whatever. But Moorcock was doing, in some ways, what Tolkien was doing, which is writing reams and reams and reams and reams of stuff, some of which was contradictory, some of which was complementary, some of which was reinventing things. The difference between Tolkien and Moorcock was Moorcock published everything he wrote. Every single thing he wrote, he published. So it's all there.
Yeah.
Whereas with Tolkien, there's no point worrying about canon with Tolkien, is there? Because if you read the History of Middle-earth volumes, I think I had one, was it The Treason of Isengard? I can't remember which one it was. I remember reading it back in the early 90s when they came out. And Strider was originally a hobbit called Trotter.
Yeah.
So let's not worry too much about the Rings of Power when there is so much Tolkien content out there which is contradictory.
Yeah. I think even like the stuff in the Silmarillion, which contradicts the stuff in Lord of the Rings. I mean, Silmarillion was posthumous, and all the history of Middle Earth, the history of Lord of the Rings was all published posthumously. So you could probably lay your hands on everything he wrote, but it was all the working drafts. But it all done for very different reasons, because he was sort of essentially writing it for his own amusement, and whereas Moorcock was publishing magazines and just wanted to get this stuff out and make a living.
You know what, since we've mentioned the Rings of Power, maybe we should have 5 minutes on the Rings of Power. Why not?
Yeah. I'll talk about elves all day.
Seeing as we're winging it, right?
Yeah.
So the Rings of Power people can now find out whether we're part of the woke mob or Tolkien purists. But it's funny, and I think a lot of people are experiencing the same thing. I've been watching Rings of Power in parallel with House of the Dragon, and I think what I am doing is resisting the urge to compare them, because it's, you know, they're both fantasies, but they are like apples and oranges, really. But I didn't find myself having a massive emotional connection to Rings of Power until it really kind of got going. And I think a lot of people's keystone episode was the big scrap where the Numenorians come and have fights with orcs. And I struggled with that a little bit, because I was actually, to some extent, sympathetic to the orcs. I think I was more sympathetic to the orcs than anybody else.
But they're making the orcs more sympathetic, right?
Yeah.
They're at least talking about, well, they're individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did find it amusing that, what did they call the fallen elf who was in charge of the orcs?
Oh, Adar or Adar.
Adar, yeah.
Which means father, I believe.
Yeah. I did love that was Benjen Stark. And he didn't look that dissimilar from when he turned up as undead Benjen Stark in Game of Thrones. That guy must, yeah, I mean, it's great for him. He must make a few quid out of getting these roles. But I kind of really appreciated the fact that they cast him, because I think he's great.
Well, he's going to do double the business at conventions now.
Absolutely, yeah. Good luck to him on that as well. But I have found it a little bit. I mean, it looks glorious. Obviously, it looks super lush and expensive, and that's fine. I do sometimes think I wish they'd had another pass at the scripts, just to talk about some of the dialogue. And I did enjoy, actually, and even despite myself, I felt quite smug about the stranger in the meteorite, because I thought I had an inkling that he was one of the Astari at the very least when he fell from the sky, and the fact that he was, spoilers people, the fact that he was interacting with the hobbits from the moment he landed would explain Gandalf's fondness for hobbits, and it all worked. So when that, I shouldn't have done, but when that played out at the end and he had the confrontation with the three followers of Sauron, and gave him the big fuck off pill with his powers, I did do a little fist bump. Sorry, a fist pump in the air, and that's the point where I really felt fully engaged with it emotionally for the first time, was that little fist pump.
Yeah.
You know. So while you tell me about your take on Rings of Power, I'm just going to open up a Wild Beer Company Millionaire Milk Stout.
I mean, I'm very easy to please with TV, and if I'm in, halfway through the second episode, I'm probably going to be in the whole way through. I'm a little bit sort of surprised. It seemed so obvious that we were meant to think he was Gandalf that I was expecting them to do something different. But if they'd done something different, I think, I would have been slightly disappointed, because he's so obvious. I mean, they've not said it yet, but it just feels like it's got to be Gandalf, with the hobbits, and he looks like him, and he sort of acts like him. I can't see him being Saruman. I guess he could be one of the blue wizards, because he's going over to the east, and that's the only thing we know about them. I can't see him being Saruman. But
I thought for a moment maybe Radagast. But then his final line is, "If in doubt, follow your nose," and that cements it, doesn't it? Really, unless they're going for some kind of ridiculous swerve in season 2. And the only swerve I would accept is if it's Tom Bombadil.
Well, yeah. I mean, I would love to see Tom Bombadil, because if you can pull that off, if you can do a ridiculous character like that, it will make me so happy, because the one character who's never adapted, but I think Tom is meant to have been there from the very beginning.
That's right.
I don't know how much we're supposed to be looking back at the lore. I had a quick look in my Tolkien bestiary when this all started, and it said, well, the wizards came over from the west on a boat in the Third Age. But I've since found out, and this is something I didn't realize, is that the Tolkien Bestiary, which is a book I had in the 80s, written by David Day, he made up loads of that stuff. So I can't trust.
Okay.
I can't trust anything in the Tolkien bestiary.
Right. So actually, the Astari coming to Middle Earth in the Third Age was an invention of David Day.
I don't know. It's in that book,
All right.
because I tried to read the Silmarillion and failed. So the thing I always turned to was that book because the art's so beautiful in it.
Yeah. It's got all that beautiful Ian Miller art, hasn't it?
Yeah. Ian Miller. There's some John Blanche stuff.
Yeah.
Some pre games or pre Warhammer John Blanche.
Yeah.
And they get the same artists, like the same artist does all the elf stuff, and then the same artist, like Ian Miller, does all the dwarf stuff and all the dragon stuff, and they kind of parcel it out. And blanking on the name of the guy that did the elves.
Of course, the wood elf illustrations are beautiful.
Yeah, and all the Hobbit stuff is just incredible. So yeah, I don't know how much we can trust what's in that book. I can't imagine you would make something like that up, but I mean, I like the idea of them falling from the sky rather than coming over on a boat.
Yeah, it's quite nice. That
why not?
Yeah, that book is wonderful. I've got that on a shelf somewhere, and I used to have it in the 80s, then lost it, and I managed to pick up a really nice hardcover with the dust cover a few years ago, again off eBay. But I think it went on the shelf, and I've never actually looked at it. I'm going to have to pull that off the shelf, I think, and give that a good look, because it is a beautiful book. Yeah. Obviously, it's Gandalf. He's not going to be Tom Bombadil. But I would, because Tom Bombadil was there and remembers the first Acorns, he's got to be there somewhere. He's got to be around, and he's there to be had, isn't he? I wonder if the stories that they actually have the rights to includes Tom Bombadil.
Well, that's the big surprising thing. When I first heard about this, it's like, it's going to be the Silmarillion, and they don't have the rights to the Silmarillion. So all the sort of Beren and Luthien stuff and all the Morgoth stuff is not going to be seen. So it's all Second Age, and it's all the stuff that was just basically listed in the appendices, I guess. So you can play around with it, I suppose. I've been enjoying it. I think of anyone of my vintage, you see Lenny Henry, and that's a thumbs up, because for Absolutely. Our generation, he gets a lifetime pass from me, and he was great in it. He was very good. I mean, spoiler alert, not in season 2.
I'm not entirely convinced by the Cod Irish accent, but that aside,
weird choice.
That aside, I thought he was really, really good in it. He's got gravitas now, hasn't he?
Yeah,
he's got real presence and real gravitas. And I mean, God, the last time I seem to remember, I know I saw him acting in a Doctor Who episode. But probably the last time I saw him acting before that was playing a pirate DJ in the 80s in a sitcom.
Delbert Wilkins.
I'm
surprised he didn't do the Dudley, the proper Dudley accent, because like the Hobbits do tend to be a bit West Country in later years, but I guess they wanted to just do something different. I love the look of them. They had just a slight slightly sort of fairy look.
It's brilliant, isn't it? The acorns in the hair, all that stuff.
Sort of taking them back to what they were originally thought to be. I guess it's cool to see Numenor, and that sort of Greek Greco-Roman stuff. I mean, my only I'm so easily pleased. I really am. The only thing I thought was stupid and ridiculous was, I think, the end of the 7th episode, where it's just, I mean, the Southlands as a title, and it bursts into flame to Mordor. I mean, that's like just camp. Like, you just didn't need it.
It's not only camp. It's like, eat this cud and understand where we're going and what we're talking about. For all you thick fuckers, let's spell it out for you.
If you'd not worked it out by that point. I mean, I had to have it pointed out to me that the Southlands were Mordor in like the first episode, because I was like, it's just, I guess it's sort of Gondor area. Because you never quite work out, even they kept showing you the map. It's like, what's vaguely in that general direction. But there's a guy on YouTube called Corey Olsen, I believe. He teaches Tolkien at an American university, and he does like these long lengthy YouTube breakdowns of each episode. And he's like, and of course the Southlands, this is what will become Mordor, obviously. And I'm like, what's that? Was that obvious?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and like obviously later on it becomes very obvious,
Yeah.
But
I like all that. I love the reveal of Mount Doom. I love the special effects. I love the eruption, the ash, all that
mhm.
stuff. I think Morfydd Clark is brilliant in anything that she's in. Have you seen Saint Maud?
I haven't. No, I've never seen her in anything other
She
than
did a
this.
film called Saint Maud about 18 months, 2 years ago, about a nurse who goes to provide living care for a once famous actress and dancer who has a terminal illness. And there are a few other characters pop up in it, but for the most part, it could be a stage play with two actors. She is absolutely fantastic in it. What a great film! Thoroughly recommend anybody watch Saint Maud with Morfydd Clark. It's wonderful, brilliant film, and quite dark and twisted as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, well, that's Rings of Power put to bed, isn't it? And
You've been listening to Rings of Powercast.
yeah, but if they don't get Bombadil in there at some point in the 5 seasons that they're planning, then I will condemn it. Then I will do a clickbait YouTube show that demolishes it and
Yeah,
and try and earn some of those YouTube dollars.
yeah, you get a screenshot of one of the actors and make them have red eyes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Make their mouth gape open.
yeah.
Yeah, just put him in the background, put him in one scene.
Mm-hmm.
I think a little bit of Tom goes a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. Even hint at him, even have
Yeah.
him just off screen, and something weird happening that can only be attributed to Bombadil. I'd be all over that like a rush. I would love it. But then I've always been a Bombadil fan. But interestingly, obviously we've got this big Rings of Power series. We've got House of the Dragon going gangbusters, as is the expression, on HBO Max and doing very well, and continuing to rip off the visual identity of Elric and the Dragon Isle and everything else. The guy who grew up to have the scar and the eye patch with the long white hair, that guy, yeah, coon for me, but too late, already been done. So that's all going well, but of course now we've got this news about the Apple TV Plus David Goyer helmed Eternal Champion TV show. Good lord!
Okay, well, I've not heard about that.
Oh,
I'd heard about a Hawkmoon show.
Right. Well, David Goyer interviewed in Variety, talking about what he's got on, and essentially, one of the things he's working on that's in pre-development for Apple TV Plus is an Eternal Champion TV series being done by the people who did the Foundation series and Sandman for Netflix. And in an interview, in a post on Facebook, Moorcock explained that he's been in negotiations about this for quite a lengthy period of time, and the BBC guys have handed back their option on History of the Rune stuff.
Right, okay.
So 3 years of development come to nothing.
It's everything. It's the whole.
It's everything that was ever published in the United States by the White Wolf publishers. So all of the Eternal Champion, but no Michael Caine. I don't know, Michael Caine has been kind of retrospectively branded an aspect of the Eternal Champion, but that's weak. No Dances at the End of Time, and no another one. I can't remember. But anyway, but it does include Von Beck. Yeah. It includes Hawkmoon. It includes Elric. It includes Coram. It includes Ilian of Garethorn. So interesting news. Probably another 2 or 3 years of development, but if anybody's going to get something to series and get it on Apple TV Plus, it's probably David S. Goyer, because he just seems to have carte blanche to do whatever the hell he wants. So, interesting times.
I mean, the mind boggles, because like with all that material, you could just go crazy, with not having to necessarily adapt every book, but adapt aspects and to be able to interweave these worlds. I mean that's going to be another expensive prospect.
Yeah,
but,
I think it depends
when I heard about the BBC doing Hawkmoon, it's like, are they going to be able to do Hawkmoon? The things that are in the Hawkmoon books. There's a lot. There's a lot.
Yeah,
but
I did wonder about the BBC Room Staff series, but I think if you're going to do something that has a cute, hard-edged parody of the worst of British tendencies. Is a British broadcaster the best one to do it? I don't know. The problem with Apple TV Plus and my problem with the Foundation series was that it was style over substance. And that's my fear of it. That it'll take the central trappings of it, but it'll lose the bite.
Mm.
You know? And also with it being an Eternal Champion TV show, what's the in gonna be? Is it gonna be it's gonna be John Dacre in New York, probably. He's gonna be American. An American producer, an American TV show for an American streamer. John Dacre is gonna be American. And that instantly starts to make my shit itch before I even get anywhere with it. But you know, I'll hold up any potential paranoia or criticism because we've always got the books, so it doesn't really matter, does it?
Yeah. I mean, Goya's had a lot to do with Sandman over the years. I think he's a producer on the Netflix show, right? Or it's something to do with it. Yeah. I mean, and I love Sandman. Like that was one of the key texts of my early 20s. I was a proper game and bore back then. And I'm astonished that it eventually got made, and I'm astonished that he got to make the version that he is obviously wanting to make. And you know, it's not this bastardized version, but at the same time, it's a nicer, kinder, gentler Sandman, and it's not as nasty and it's not as disturbing as those early comics. And you know, maybe people just wouldn't want to see that stuff. I was dreading episode 5, the 24 hours. I was like thinking, I think that's genuinely one of the most disturbing things I've ever read. And I sort of was putting off watching it. Like, can I even handle this? You know. And at the end of the day, it wasn't the same thing. And I think if you'd made that, people would have just turned off in droves. You know.
I think if you've got an actor the quality of David Thewlis anchoring that, then it's a good start.
Yeah.
It's a good start. David Thewlis was great in that. And you're right, actually, they did Netflix Sandman. They didn't transpose any of it unnecessarily to America. So, you know, maybe there is hope for all of this. I hope so.
Yeah, that amount of stories, and you know, those the amount of characters, you could just take the absolute best of each one and you know, blend stuff together. You know, obviously Elric was not, you know, conceived as a great saga. Elric was conceived as you know, these very, very short episodic, you know, pulpy stories originally, and you could either do that or you could do the kind of lengthy sort of saga version of it.
I think my preference probably would have been to have interlinked series, but if they have to do an Eternal Champion series and no one character really gets as much due and exposure and development as would like, it's still as a visual treat for the senses. I'm sure seeing Elric wielding Stormbringer at the end of the world and blowing the horn of fate, if they can pull that off, you know, even if I'm cynical about it, I'll still get a kick out of it.
Of course, yeah.
But going back a little bit, you mentioned that edition of White Dwarf and the Thrud the Barbarian strip. It's just popped into my head. And I suppose for people who weren't gamers or didn't read White Dwarf, what was Thrud the Barbarian? It was an amusing parody strip about a barbarian by Carl Critchlow that was one page. And what were the other ones? There was a Traveller strip, wasn't there?
Was The Travellers by Mark Harrison.
Yeah.
It went on to do like a lot of 2000 AD stuff, I think.
Yeah. And there was Gobbledygook.
Gobbledygook by Bill.
Yeah. I loved Gobbledygook.
Yeah.
But one of my favourite things, there was not only Eric of Melny Boney or Boney Malone.
Boney Maloney. Yeah.
Boney Maloney. There was Croneman the Simpleton. Which at one point Thrud cleaves him from the head down to his groin, and the next time you see Croneman the Simpleton is still doing flexy muscle poses. It's just got big obvious stitches all the way down his body. If anybody, if you like parody fantasy barbarian comedy strips, try and seek out the Thrud the Barbarian collected strips because they're hugely entertaining.
When I was 15, that was the most sophisticated erudite humour I'd ever encountered. I thought it was brilliant. I mean, looking back, some of it's rather broad, but fantastically drawn. And Carl Critchlow went on to do 2000 AD stuff as well.
Yeah, and he went on to do full painted artwork as well, and covers and everything, didn't he? He was very, very talented. I did at one point think he was jumping, like a couple of others did, on the trail that Simon Bisley laid.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of like style and airbrushing and all that business, but still hugely impressive stuff.
There was the demand for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Bisley took forever to do anything, so I can understand why they might have looked elsewhere.
Yeah.
But I can remember sitting in my bedroom with that one. I think it's like a Magnificent Seven type thing, even to the point where it's Mexican villagers that they're trying to help out, and Croneman the Simpleton is one of them, and he's flexing his muscles with his stitched up gash all the way down his body. I just remember sitting there howling with laughter at it for ages. But anyway, back to Moorcock and art. Moorcock art.
I remember.
See, Wigan, it's fine. But go back to Moorcock art. So those striking covers, you talked about the Elric novels, or the Grantham covers. Michael Whelan, of course.
Yeah.
Michael Whelan did those really, really super striking covers where Elric was generally underdressed. I think you get a variety of styles for Elric. One of my favourite Elric paintings, or cover paintings, which will be controversial, is the Jack Gorn cover to the 60s Ace pocketbook edition of Stormbringer.
I think I've got that. When we first talked about this, I made a PDF of some examples.
It's right here.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason I love this so much is because this was one of my first two Moorcocks given to me by Pops, both Ace pocketbook editions. This one, Stormbringer, the other one being Warlord of the Air, late 60s edition of Warlord of the Air.
Yeah.
And I absolutely adore this cover. It's generally people's least favourite take on Elric. And when Barry Windsor Smith was first asked to do Elric for a Conan the Barbarian or Savage Sword of Conan strip, he didn't have any frame of reference for Elric. He'd never read Michael Moorcock, so somebody gave him a copy of this book. Yeah. And Moorcock was gutted. Because, and we'll try and pop an image of this in the video, and I'll put it in the show notes. But how do you describe this cover? Well, I really love kind of the 60s artistic interpretation of, I assume, some kind of castle, or maybe even the Dreaming City behind him. Yeah. But Elric is wearing what looks to be a very nice bottle green jacket with bottle green trews and a huge pair of thigh-length black kinky boots. He's also, it's either kinky boots or waders. And he's wearing a red cloak, and he's got a pointy wizard's hat. Yeah. And I love it. And
he's not unlike Coram in this picture, is he?
That's right. Yeah, this could easily have been Coram, couldn't it?
Yeah.
And I absolutely adore it because it's just one of my first. But I do understand why it's a controversial choice.
Sure, yeah.
So, your favourite Elric cover art? Can you pin it down?
I can, and I think one of the first things we ever spoke about when we met at Thought Bubble, we talked about the Michael Whelan books, which they were the sort of main books that I had growing up, and the ones I've actually got now. I've dug out all my Moorcock books, so there's the Bane of the Backsword, but this is my absolute favourite. That's such an atmospheric. Badass, and the coming out of the mist. It's just beautiful. I mean, I think Whelan is.
So, listeners, we're talking Sailor on the Seas of Fate, the Grafton Stroke Panther or the Daw edition. Just so people know what we're on about.
Oh yeah, I should have said, shouldn't I? Sailor on the Seas of Fate. I just think that's such a phenomenal image. I think Whelan, I loved him at the time. And so, like some of the more sort of stylized, sort of more sort of psychedelic, the Bob Haberfield covers, I did not like at that age. I wanted everything to look dead realistic, and obviously these are the closest thing you have to sort of 80s Dungeons and Dragons, and a little bit like some of the Games Workshop stuff. I used to, unfortunately, I don't have it anymore, but I used to have an art book of Michael Whelan. It was called Wonder Worlds or Wonder Works or something like that. And Moorcock wrote an introduction. He had a section on sci-fi, he had a section on fantasy, a section on horror, maybe. Yeah. And the section on fantasy was written by Moorcock. And Moorcock just very effusive in his praise. But one thing that sticks out that I vividly remember, he says, Whelan gives Elric muscles in a market that demands muscles.
Yeah.
My hero is something of a weakling. So I think when people say, the Geralt of Rivia, as played by Henry Cavill, is an Elric ripoff. I mean, he kind of looks like Henry Cavill in some of these paintings. He's proper. He's brick shithouse level,
buff, isn't he?
Whereas some of the other artists do kind of lean into the kind of more rangy string bean qualities of him.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I absolutely love them. The very first Elric book I read, which was the Elric and Melniboné from the library in Gloucester, it was by an artist called Lawrence Cutting, and it's this weird photographic cover. And I'll send you a copy if you don't know the one I mean. But I guess it's Elric and Yyrkoon. But it looks kind of like a photograph of a statue, maybe in like
it's an Arrow book. It's an Arrow published book version, isn't it? Yeah. My mate Yaki sent me that a couple of years ago as part of a birthday present. Yeah, it's very odd. It's like a classical statue, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is a strange choice. I was going to say, yeah, so Whelan, yeah, definitely buff Elric, definitely scantily clad Elric as well. Always got his thighs out. Very classic fantasy cover. Nevertheless, really cool. And that edition of Sailor on the Seas of Fate is the first Moorcock book I ever bought myself,
right,
with my pocket money.
Yeah.
And not only was I blown away by that art, but I was blown away by the story as well. But as well as that Arrow Books edition, there's Sailor on the Seas of Fate and Elric of Melniboné. Also later Arrow editions, I think, where I think the Elric of Melniboné one, he looks like he's pulling the blue steel pose from Zoolander. And the Sailor on the Seas of Fate one, or is it Stealer of Souls? I can't remember. Again, he's bright blue and looking a bit kind of wild-eyed, like he's been up for a few days or something. Not interesting covers, not necessarily favourites, but interesting interpretations.
I mean, this is, you might want to cut this out because this is just solely based on my memory, but I believe in that Michael Whelan book, another thing that Moorcock wrote was he'd had a lot of depictions of Elric that he didn't like. And he said the very first book that Elric appeared on, I mean, again, I'm thinking back 30 years and paraphrasing.
Yeah.
He said the artist clearly didn't know what an albino was, and he looked it up in a dictionary, and there were some American dictionaries that defined an albino as a black man but with no colouring. So Moorcock was saying that there is one Elric book where he's a black man,
right?
And I've tried to find that, and I've looked around, and the nearest thing I can find is there's a Brian Lewis cover on Science Fantasy number 47 that's got The Dreaming City by Moorcock in it, and there is a fantasy warrior who maybe you could see him as having dark skin, but he's not necessarily Elric. But it's a crazy, he's got a green cloak and a sort of checkerboard tunic.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the one he meant. I mean, maybe he wasn't even remembering it right, because obviously this is from the depths of the 60s, and he was obviously writing the Michael Whelan book in like the early 80s, I guess. But I've never quite been able to track that down. So who knows? And it's a shame I don't have the Whelan book anymore.
It's interesting because one of the RPGs, it might be one of the Mongoose Elric RPG books, has got I think it's a pencil art illustration of Elric on one of the first pages, and he has African features.
Right.
But I love it. I think it's really, really beautiful. But I don't think I've ever seen anything else. I think probably the wildest and most unusual Elric I've ever seen is actually in the Stormbringer third edition Games Workshop one, where you've got the colour plates, and there's one with a spiky white mullet who looks like Rob Alford in black armour.
Yeah.
And I remember the 80s thinking that was really cool when I was a metal fan. I look at it now and think, nah, that didn't really work for me.
Yeah. That had a lot of Frank Brunner art,
Yeah.
which I thought that was, again, he looks a lot, he's dressed a lot like the Michael Whelan stuff, but he's a little bit more stringy.
Yeah.
And that I felt they were quite sort of defining. And with his name being Brunner, like,
yeah,
I feel there's some weird.
Got to be a connection there, hasn't there?
Yeah, there's some weird nomenclature stuff, because when I think in the Imagine magazine he talks about James Cawthorne, and James Cawthorne was always a bit of a mystery figure.
Yeah.
But then he talks about James Colvin being one of his pseudonyms, and it's like, oh, is Cawthorne one of his pseudonyms as well? Because I'd read about this artist Cawthorne, but I'd never seen any of his work. And obviously, at this late stage, you can find everything the man ever drew. But at the time, you just read the name in a book and think, oh, was he drawing as well as writing? These little connections, and JC as well with Jerry O'Connell and Jerry Cornelius.
And that's what he was credited as for co-writing The Distant Sons. There's a really, really terrific art book of Cawthorne's art came out in the last couple of years that's co-written along with John Davey of J Design by Cawthorne's sister.
Right.
And thoroughly recommend that. It's not only has it got a lot of really fantastic Cawthorne art, Elric art, various other things as well, things like Doc Savage, and lots and lots of different things, but it's also got Eternal Champion sketches that were never used anywhere and were basically seen largely for the first time in that book. And of course, J Design also did the hardcover slip-cased Cawthorne Stormbringer,
right,
with all of the art he did for a Stormbringer adaptation, which is all really fantastic. And of course, he did talking about Elric a lot, but he did the Jewel in the Skull for Savoy as well, which is really cool. It doesn't really work as a comic.
No.
But the individual panels of art are really cool.
Yeah, it's more like an illustrated book, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, he's absolutely fascinating, and I think any fan that's not like sort those out, I feel like they're essential, just because he clearly knew Moorcock so well. Moorcock's spoken about him in interviews, and it's interesting to contrast the American Hawkmoon comics of Raphael Kayanan, first comics. Editions with the Cawthorne ones. There's just such a strange sort of surreal vibe to Cawthorne. I mean, as an example, in the Raphael Kanan edition, where some of it's fantastic, some of it's not great. I think when he's either inking himself or there's a particular inkers, they're fantastic, but some of them aren't quite so good. But when he's drawing like the slaves of Gran Bretagne, they look like girls in a Motley Crue video. It's like very much like an American sort of heavy metal. Whereas the when you see that in the Cawthorne, they really do look kind of crushed, and you really kind of get the sense of the horror of the Dark Empire. And there's so many sort of strange things going on in the background in those books, and the time it must have taken him to do, like, all in kind of pen and ink, and like cross hatching, and all this detail in the architecture. It's fascinating. He just seems like a one-off, that guy.
There's nothing else quite like it. And in terms of the level of detail, when you get into things like battle scenes as well, I mean, he must have labored over those boards for, well, I don't know how long. I'm not an artist, so I don't know how long these things take, but it must have took him a while. Just the incredible amount of detail. You mentioned First Comics as well, of course, and I've got to confess, whilst I do enjoy comics, and I'll consider myself a comic fan, I'm always a little bit more distant from them when they're adaptations of things that I really, really love. And whilst I appreciate things like the Cawthon, but as you said, the more like abridged, illustrated stories. In terms of the main Eternal Champion adaptations by people like First Comics, and okay, when they've slipped into Marvel as well, I've never been entirely satisfied by them. And sometimes I do really appreciate the psychedelic nature of some of the P. Craig Russell stuff and how colourful and wacky it looks. But there's just always something ever so slightly goofy about it, which kind of puts me off a little bit. And then at the opposite end of the scale, you've got the Julian Blondell comics, now released as graphic novels, where the artwork is absolutely exquisite, but it goes to the opposite end of the scale and loses all of the psychedelic weirdness and just becomes grim and gothic.
Yeah.
And I'd really love a balance between those two things.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure it exists currently.
Yeah, well, I'm a big Mike Mignola fan, and the Corran books, he did the Knight of the Swords, and I think he might have done the first 2 or 3 issues of Queen of the Swords.
Yeah.
I think he's and his style completely changed. If you know him from Hellboy in the 80s, he was like drawing Superman and Batman, and he had a much different style. I mean, I think he hates that style, but when he was working on Corran, there's something. I think he captures some of the weirdness. I mean, I think Knight of the Swords is clearly the best Corran book, and I think the ideas in it are so amazing. And obviously, I was sort of pre-sold on that, but they're absolutely wonderful. And I think I heard an interview with Moorcock recently where he spoke very, very highly of Mignola. But yeah, I mean, you sometimes adapting things that just cannot be adapted. I forget who did Sailor on the Seas of Fate, but like you should never try and draw the 4 who are one, because it just doesn't work visually. Yeah. And if they were meant to make that into a film, you'd be on a hide into nothing, because there's nothing that can get across the sort of insanity of what's on the page and what the images that creates in your mind. Those things do tend to look kind of goofy and just a bit weird, but not kind of capturing the horror and not capturing the absolute psychedelic madness of some of that stuff. So, I mean, I think if you were to ever, down the line, you were to ever adapt some of these things, they'd probably take a Marvel approach where you use the original stories as a jumping off point to kind of tie some of those things together and make something that works as a film or works as a TV series, rather than just kind of do a straight adaptation. But I mean, what do I know? I'm not a writer or anything like that, but it's tricky. Adaptation's always tricky, because you're always going to disappoint people who want to exactly see what they read in a book, and that's impossible,
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is, and I know what I like. I don't know much, but I know what I like.
Yeah.
And that's, at the end of the day, that's all you can talk about. We've never made any claims for this being an academic podcast. it's all a game of opinions. But yeah, that Sailor on the Seas of Fate adaptation you mentioned, the 4 horror 1 bit, no, it just doesn't work at all.
Well, no artist could do that.
But I do appreciate the fact that it will bring people into Moorcock's worlds who haven't been exposed to them before. And of course, there are various other Moorcock comics as well. There was the Multiverse comic, wasn't there, with the John Ridgway art and the Walter Simonson art. And who did the other art? I can't remember off the top of my head. That ran for 12 issues. That was interesting. An interesting run. And again, I prefer that kind of thing because they're original stories. So you had, the metatemporal detective in there. You had an original Elric story, which I think is in medieval England.
Yeah.
And you had the Walter Simonson drawn story, Moonbeams and Roses, which pulls in not only Von Beck, but the Pirates of the Second Ether and the Chaos Engineers and elements from Blood and Fabulous Harbours. And it's been a while since I've read it, but I remember reading it at the time thinking, I ain't got a fucking clue what's going on. I ain't got a clue what's going on here. What's this all about? I probably should revisit that. And then he's done various other bits and pieces. He's done an Elric prequel called Making of a Sorcerer.
Yeah.
So there's so much stuff out there. So if you're into comics and you're just into interpretations of Moorcock, you're spoilt for choice. Absolutely spoilt for choice. You know, it's a shame in a way that whilst you've got the interpretations in comics, you've got, you know, the role playing games, which added a lot of material and a lot of background, courtesy of people like Lawrence Whitaker and Gareth Hanrahan, who kind of fleshed out, you know, details of the worlds. But yeah, that additional step into the visual medium is still out there and still waiting to happen. We discussed the Apple TV show. Maybe there'll be some kind of computer game or something at some point. That's a surprise that there's never really been anything.
Yeah.
When you consider, you know, all of the open world role playing games out there, why not have Tragic Millennium Europe as a setting for that? You know, give me a Tragic Millennium Europe Skyrim mod immediately, and I'll be all over it. Be all over it. Although there's somebody out there who's done a Stormbringer mod for Skyrim in terms of the sword.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, we need that. We need that full conversion mod for Skyrim, don't we?
I think one of the things Moorcock said in that interview in Imagine was they were asking him about a film, and obviously this is 85.
Yeah.
And he was like, oh, you know, there's been some talks, but I think ultimately producers find it's easier to steal ideas than pay for them. And I think so many ideas have been stolen. When I first discovered Nemesis the Warlock in 2000 AD, I read that before I read any Moorcock, but kind of thinking back, there's so many parallels there. And, you know, like the Nemesis the Warlock computer game on the Spectrum. I remember sort of wielding the sword, and by that time I'd read Elric, and like, this feels very Elric.
Yeah.
I mean, Kevin O'Neill, isn't it? I think I'd love to see some Kevin O'Neill Moorcock artwork.
Oh yeah, imagine Kevin O'Neill's Londra. Oh, good lord, that would be a sight to behold. But yeah, Pat Mills definitely mined Moorcock for inspiration, which is interesting considering he's a little bit snippy about Moorcock from time to time.
Oh, really?
On Twitter, yeah,
right.
Yeah, because Moorcock in the 70s, when Pat Mills and Des Skin, I think it was Des Skin, were making Action comic, the one with the infamous cover of the kids are okay, with a kid with a chain wrapped around his fist, booting a copper in the face. So there was a lot of controversy about that. And at the time, Moorcock was part of a journalists association. And Moorcock was particularly vocal about not only Action comic, but early 2000 AD.
Yeah.
And he was very anti them. And he didn't have very nice things to say about anything that Pat Mills or John Wagner were writing. And whereas I think John Wagner just shrugs these kind of things off. I like John Wagner a lot. I've come across him a couple of times, not only Thought Bubble, but a Sci-Fi Weekend, a thing that we've gone to on and off for a few years.
Yeah.
And he's a really interesting bloke to stand outside and have a roll-up with and just have a chat. And I think to him, stuff like this, water for ducks back. But I think Pat Mills has always seems to have rankled a little bit about that. Yeah. And he's not afraid of having a couple of snippy comments about Moorcock. But at the end of the day, he certainly mined Moorcock for plenty of ideas.
Well, I think Grant Morrison too has made some snippy comments about Moorcock, and Moorcock's made some snippy comments about Grant Morrison, which is, you know, I mean, obviously there's a clear influence there, and sometimes it's overt. And
there was an element.
Why can't they all get on?
Yeah, why can't everybody get along? The Alan Moorcock axis against the Grant Morrison evil seems to have been a thing on and off over the years, doesn't it? So I think Moorcock has been quoted as saying that he thinks Gideon Stargrave is just an out-and-out rip-off of Jerry Cornelius.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, he doesn't seem to have a problem with Luther Arkwright. So it's you know, it's all about personality and who you like and you don't like, isn't it? And recently, a guy on Twitter, Joachim Bose, pointed out something from a book a monograph about Frank Brunner, saying from the perspective of John Brunner, the British science fiction author.
Yeah.
And from his perspective, feeling that Moorcock and a lot of his compadres in the 60s bullied him and had parties where they burned his books. You know what? Nobody's clean in this war of criticism and feeling like somebody's been making hay on your dime. I think there's whenever it comes to exceptionally creative people, being snippy about each other seems to be par for the course.
Yeah.
So, having never read Gideon Stargrave, I don't really kind of have an opinion or an angle on it.
Yeah, I've only sort of encountered it in sort of texts about comics. My impression was it was, it made no bones about the fact that he was a version of Jerry Cornelius.
Yeah.
But maybe I'm misremembering.
The weird thing is, Moorcock went through a period of time where he was really, really delighted for people to collaborate and create their own Jerry Cornelius stories. But it definitely appears to be the case that works if you're M. John Harrison, J.G. Ballard, or any of the New Worlds crew. So, who knows? Who knows? I mean, he let Guy Lawley do it for Saga of the Man Elf. Yeah. So maybe it's just a case of if you drop Moorcock a line and say, "Hello, Mike, I'm doing X. Do you mind?" Maybe that's the deal. Maybe Grant didn't do that. I don't know.
Yeah, well, you catch him on a good day. I feel like he's mellowed over the years because like interviews I've read, he did seem to be an angry young man for a long time. And like every time I've heard like recent interviews, he just seems absolutely lovely, full of a sense of humor, like not taking himself too seriously and being full of praise for all these other artists who've either adapted his work or that he's worked with.
Yeah. And then you see some of the interviews with him from the late 60s and early 70s where he's wearing a crushed velvet green jacket and holding a cigarette but never smoking it.
Yeah.
And with a little curled up moustache.
Yeah.
And he looks incredibly pretentious.
Yeah.
And then a few years later, Joe Banks sent me an MP4 of a BBC Moorcock documentary that's about 25 minutes long. And he's being interviewed in the living room of the house he's living in with some other guy whose name I forget, and he looks like something from a Robert Crumb's comics. It's absolutely amazing. He's got his little pot belly. He's wearing a super tight turquoise t-shirt. He's got flares on. He's got his legs crossed. It's absolutely amazing. Yeah. He looks just straight out of a Robert Crumb comic. And the guy he's living with is just kind of like sitting there staring with a 1,000-yard stare, staring into the carpet. It's brilliant. We'll have to find a screen grab of that, and if we ever do a visual video version of this for YouTube, we'll drop it in because it really is fantastic. But yeah, it's certainly the case that people mellow. Yeah. And we all do, don't we? I was a massive dickhead when I was 25. I hadn't published about 14 books by the time I was 25. I was still a massive dickhead.
Well, I mean, hopefully we mellow in some ways and we don't mellow in others.
Yeah.
But I remember seeing an interview with Moorcock, and I don't know what it was from. It seems like it was something on the BBC in like the late 60s, and they're asking him about the Beatles, and he's saying, well, they're as good as Brahms. They're not better than Brahms. And I'm like, why would the BBC feel the need to ask a sci-fi author what he thought of the Beatles? But obviously the Beatles, it was just kind of distorting culture all around them, and like everyone had to have an opinion. And this question of whether it could be comparable with classical music was obviously bobbing some people up the wrong way.
I think that's the same interview I'm thinking of, where he's got the crushed velvet jacket on, and the interviewer is wearing like round glasses and he's got a bald head and wearing a black suit, and just doesn't really seem to understand who he's talking to. So he's just asking him, oh yeah, you're an artist of sorts. What do you think about, I don't know, Some Mothers Do Have Them or whatever? It's really, but it is funny watching him in that interview.
Yeah. I remember like when I'd only ever seen photographs of him and I'd only ever read interviews, I had a completely different idea of what his voice would be. And because he slightly resembles Peter Grant, Led Zeppelin's manager, I always heard his quote in Peter Grant's voice. Peter Grant's got this slightly sort of wheeling, kind of, doesn't quite fit his look, his gigantic bear of a man who like held people out of windows by their ankles. And I imagine Moorcock had that same kind of voice. But then when you hear him on, like, the Hawkwind albums he turns up on, it's this very erudite, very sort of genteel voice that he's speaking with.
Yeah, it's very, very high, very soft.
Yeah.
That gives like a really odd intellectual kind of quality to what he's saying, and you don't know whether it's an affectation or not, and that's just what he was like at the time.
I mean, I guess I must have heard him when, not even realizing it's him on like Sonic Attack, and the wizard blew his horn on I think Warrior at the Edge of Time by Hawkwind. I remember sitting around. The one time I played AD&D, I should have been revising for my exams, and everyone came around to my house. We played AD&D all day. We listened to Sonic Attack, Warrior at the Edge of Time, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and I think Wind and Wuthering, all day. And my mum was so pissed off. It was like about 12-hour AD&D game. What that has got to do with the art of Moorcock, I don't know. But I felt compelled to tell you.
Yeah, for the uninitiated, AD&D, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which was in and of itself something of a misnomer, wasn't it? Because it wasn't really advanced. First edition AD&D was just an absolute car crash of stuff that people only ever used 10% of.
Yeah, it didn't make any sense.
No.
All different kind of subsystems.
Yeah.
No core mechanic. Yeah. I
don't
know how anyone managed it.
We're going to go off on a slight gaming tangent here, but it's the first time we've ever talked AD&D on this podcast. We've talked gaming on this podcast. Never talked AD&D on this podcast. Or D&D, I don't think, other than passing references to things like the Monster Manual and some of the RPG episodes. But one thing I really loved in AD&D that nobody would ever implement was weapon bonuses and penalties against specific types of armor. So if you had a mace, it might do less damage than a bastard sword, but it was brilliant against plate armor.
Sure, yeah.
Wasted subsystem that I really, really liked, because it made weapons different, and it gave weapons some individuality. So other than MERP, where you were fine because, I mean, you had all the tables, so you had that kind of level of individuality for weapons. And if you used a Morning Star, I think there was, if you went according to the rules of probability and you were a warrior in MERP, and again, this is Middle Earth roleplay, which had a really strange, complicated system with critical charts and referring to charts to actually decide whether you'd hit anything, which of course AD&D First Edition did as well. Before they introduced, oh God, let's not talk about Thacker. Let's just leave that there. But I do remember the sitting and crunching the numbers, and if you had a warrior or you used a Morning Star, I think we figured out there was a 1 in 200 chance of you inflicting a lethal critical against yourself from a fumble. So if you were playing a warrior, you had a life expectancy of 200 attack rolls, on average.
Yeah. Well, if you were lucky, you'd do your crush critical and your piercing critical with a Morning Star, right?
That's right. And if you're unlucky, you do them to yourself.
You do it to yourself.
I think you fumble on a 1 to 3 with a Morning Star or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it was. Although, interestingly, I could actually look it up, because just behind me, which I found a while back. Sorry, I'm talking away from my microphone there. I found a while back my homemade MERP screens.
Oh, wow.
From when I was 13. Yeah. And it's graph paper glued into white card. It's so small now that I can't read it, because I don't have my young eyes anymore. And because of the sheer number of attack tables in MERP, there's 4 of them. You're not going to sit with 4 screens, are you? But they were there.
Just need a big table.
They were just handy as references, and I even did my own dragons. Although they're simply copies. That's a copy of a Dragonlance.
That's a Dragonlance, yeah.
And I think that's definitely a D&D picture as well. I can't remember where from. Yeah.
I mean, it looks definitely in that world.
Yeah, I think it is. So yeah, God, Merp. We're talking about Tolkien again.
Yeah, this is your new podcast. It's Rings of Power and Merp.
Yeah. So we need an angry picture of Gandalf drawn by Angus McBride with red
Yeah.
eyes, looking angry. So we could say, whatever. But honourable mention when it comes to comics for Howard Chaykin's work on the Swords of Heaven, the Flowers of Hell, or is it the Flowers of Heaven, the Swords of Hell? I never remember. Because I think that was actually written by Moorcock as well, was it?
Well, that was one of the ones that was mentioned in Imagine, and that I always looked for and I could never find. And it was, is it Ericos?
And Titan have reprinted it.
Right.
In the last couple of years, so you can get a hardcover of it now. I've got an old paperback of it, which is, I think the spine is cracking on it now, but it's a little bit bigger than the Titan one, so it's a better reproduction of the art. But now available in Titan reprints. Howard Chaykin art in that is absolutely glorious. It's beautiful, really, really nice. Story's quite slight and lightweight, but the art is really fabulous. But I mean, it's Howard Chaykin painted art. You're not going to go far wrong with it.
You can't go wrong there.
And it's got that level of realism to it, the Howard Chaykin art as well. Yeah. So, yeah. Now then, because we're winging it, I need to refer to my winging it questions that I had for you.
It's not a critical table from Merp.
It's not a critical table from Merp. What I should have done was put something together and make you roll on it.
Yeah.
Grognard file style. You're a gamer. Were you mostly D&D? You said you played Stormbringer, but you're mostly a D&D.
I had the basic set and the expert set. I think I played that once and then played AD&D once. But like by the time I was ready to run games, I just couldn't quite glom onto it. So I got Merp and I ran Merp a lot, and subsequently Stormbringer, and then the Judge Dredd game played a lot of, and the Star Wars game played a lot of.
Yeah.
And I feel like all those games after D&D, they were maybe a bit more complicated, but they made more sense because they all had a core mechanic, and I don't feel like D&D ever did, or I never quite worked out what it was. So I had all the D&D books and I read them a lot, but I never actually played it. And it, and I've played it, in my 40s.
Yeah.
But as a teenager, just sort of flirted with it, really. But yeah, really, just loads of Merp and loads of Stormbringer and lots of sort of one-offs of other games. I played Traveller once. I played the Star Trek role-playing game once. I think played Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles once. It was like every couple of months, one of us would buy one of these games and would run one edition of it. But it was Merp and Stormbringer that really stuck. These license games, because you had something else to fall back on. You had the books. All this other material that you could bring into it, and you'd get a sense of the world. Whereas with D&D, I think at the time I just felt, but I don't know enough about the world, know. And obviously there were 3 or 4 different settings back then, and I could have made my own up. But it's just something about having an existing universe to fall back onto, and going back to the Tolkien bestiary, I use that a lot in my games, and obviously Moorcock. There's just so much. I think you've talked about so much. There's just so much fodder for making up your own games in that, because it's like 17 crazy ideas every other paragraph.
I only played AD&D was my gateway to gaming. I think I was 11 or 12 when I was invited to go and join someone's AD&D campaign. And then I think the first game I ever bought myself, I think I saved up my pocket money and got Dungeon Master's Guide and Player's Handbook first edition. It's crazy to think that in 1983 or whatever, they were costing 15 odd quid each.
Yeah.
In 1983. So you were having to spend like 30 quid to get the core books for Dungeons and Dragons in 1983.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
It's like 80 now, isn't it?
Yeah. And my folks, I don't think I bought it myself. Maybe it was a pocket money thing. I thought, my folks got me. I got Merp. So from that point onwards, we played a lot of Merp. And then I went down things like Twilight 2000, discovered Call of Cthulhu and all that business, all good stuff. But I never did play any original rules Dungeons and Dragons. never played 3rd edition, never played 2nd edition, never played 3rd edition, never played 4th edition. When 5th edition came out, I checked it out. I quite like 5th edition.
Yeah.
I think it's quite tidy. It's quite easy to pick up. I still think it's silly that you have 3d6 for your core stats when actually all that really matters is the bonuses or the penalties.
Yeah.
They really could take a fair approach and just have you rated as +1 zeros or -1s or whatever. Still a little bit silly.
There's stuff in that game that's for nostalgia's sake, though.
Yeah.
You know.
Actually trying to explain that to new players, because the group I game with, there's Phil, my other half, of course, who used to sit in the front room and watch movies and drink wine while we were all being nerds in the kitchen until we finally convinced her to come and join us, and she's never looked back.
Yeah.
There's my cousin Emily, who hadn't played till probably 4 or 5 years ago. We convinced her to play because she was going out with a guy who played D&D. My friend Gemma, who'd never gamed before. And it was interesting because I think the first game they ever came and played, I fell back on something that I always do, because number one, I'm too lazy to read new rules, and number two, I'm too lazy to read complicated backgrounds. So I like to come up with my own settings and my own games, and I love to use Barbarians of Lemuria because it is so easily and eminently hackable. You can hack that game in half an hour. You don't need the rule book. And I did this on Saturday night. We played a science fiction game, which was kind of Outland stroke Alien stroke Event Horizon stroke Pandorum kind of setting. Sat them all down, worked through the characters together, ripped off loads of stuff from things like Alien Isolation just to throw into the game, like Seeks and Corporation and Sevastopol Station and stuff like that, just as a starting setting, and just used Barbarians of Lemuria. And it was really easy. But I remember when I said, do you all fancy playing Dungeons and Dragons? They were like, oh, now we're really stepping up into the big leagues. And I felt really offended. So I was thinking, no, I really like my game. It's really great. But the fact that they got a character sheet that looked complicated, I thought, now we're moving up to the big leagues.
Yeah.
And none of them would ever read or remember anything to do with anything between games. But they all went out and bought players' handbooks. What is it about Wizards of the Coast and Dungeons and Dragons that makes people buy their product? They have never, ever bought a single other product for any other game but Dungeons and Dragons. They all ran out and bought players' handbooks because they thought, this is like the scientific big boys and big girls way of role-playing. Yeah, incredible.
I think it's that nostalgia thing. It's that you feel like you're kind of stepping into kind of this grand tradition, you know. I mean, you know, I feel like when we were getting into gaming in the 80s, I mean, the impression I got from White Dwarf, which everyone used to read White Dwarf magazine, I got the impression that by the time I got into it, everyone was sort of a little bit bored or a little bit tired of D&D and just wanted to try other games because other games were more realistic or they're more complicated or whatever. And like maybe they'd gotten the impression that D&D was just kind of running around dungeon and fighting monsters, and that was the be all and end all. So I always kind of felt like there was a push to play other games and play lots of different games. I mean, obviously, that was like White Dwarf was being published by Games Workshop, who by that point didn't own the license to publish D&D in the UK. So it was in their interest to get people playing other games. But that's just definitely the impression that I got. But I think now people just like just Dungeons and Dragons as a phrase. It just means it's just got that sort of totemic power that, you know, maybe Twilight 2000 or Mutant Zero or any you know, Metamorphosis Alpha, just, you know, it just wouldn't mean anything to people because it's not been talked about. It's not been sort of whispered about, you know. I mean, I heard so much about Dungeons and Dragons before I even knew what it was, you know, and I kind of always got the impression, oh, it's about puzzles and it's about these intellectual problems and it's about all these kind of different things. It's like, and at the end of the day, it's not, you know, it is about fighting monsters and a lot of the time in a lot of role-playing games you're doing exactly the same thing. You're just sat around a table and you're kind of being a character and you're deciding what you're going to do, but there is just something about the sort of totemic name and the feeling that you are kind of reaching into this kind of rich history and this, you know, this gaming tradition, you know, which maybe you don't get thinking about other role-playing games where it is exactly the same.
Yeah. Funny enough, Emily, she says, "Are we playing D&D?" and she uses it interchangeably. And I know that I've regularly seen Twitter conversations where people get really irate about that. And all Grognard's getting a real stew and a real pickle about that, and about the fact that D&D has this hold on things. But you know, it's all good. If Emily says, "Are we playing D&D?" I say yes. Then she says, "What are we playing?" And I say, "A made up space game, but I will make some blue milk." So, because the first time they ever came over and we played West End Games Star Wars, which was the first time I'd ever run it or play it, because I got the anniversary slipcase.
Oh right, yeah,
it's really nice. I've never played it before. Really love it. Really love the system. But just for kicks, I made blue milk, and we all got rat-arsed on blue milk, which was coconut rum, blue balls, bit of amaretto, and then topped up with coconut milk, just in a big jug.
Yeah.
And I got white beakers that looked a bit like Stormtrooper armor. It was really cool. So we played Saturday night. What are you playing? Are we playing D&D? Yeah, we're playing D&D. What are we playing? Well, we're not playing Star Wars, but we're playing a space game. But I'll still do blue milk. And she was like, champion. It's like brilliant. Yeah.
I just got. I mean, I say just. I think it wrapped up in about March. But I was playing. I mean, for the first time ever in a long running campaign as a player, not running the game of D&D, and it was with a bunch of what I would call young people that I kind of met through the Facebook Dungeons and Dragons group, and they could not understand the concept of playing any other game other than D&D. I think they had no interest whatsoever.
Yeah.
It just had to be D&D, and sometimes I'd look on that group, and you know, someone would say something like, I'm wanting to convert D&D to be a Star Wars game, to do a Star Wars hack for D&D, and I think, you know, it should have known better, but I did answer saying, you do realize there are 3 Star Wars role-playing games you can actually get. They've been designed to do this, but you know, yeah, people, you know, it's one thing or another. It's, you know,
it's fine, isn't it? It's fine.
Yeah,
it's like
you can't tell people how to have fun.
No, and there's certainly an element with gaming where it's like if you go on some fucking team away day at work and they decide they want to do an escape room, and you just think, why am I coming to work to be forced into fun? And you get that sense sometimes from people who grumble that people want to play Dungeons and Dragons. Well, there's lots of other games out there. Why don't we do it? But it's like saying to someone who wants to go to a Justin Bieber concert, why are you going to a Justin Bieber concert when you could go and see Clutch? It's like, well, maybe I don't fucking like Clutch. You might like Clutch. I like Clutch. It's all good. Anyway, back to my list of pre-prepared questions for our winging it. So you've already talked about your favourite Elric cover, which is Sailor on the Seas of Fate, and we've talked about favourite Elric artists. But what about non-Elric Moorcock? What's your favourite, most striking non-Elric Moorcock book cover?
I mean, the one that really springs to mind, and I've got it in front of me somewhere, the Bob Haberfield Mad God's Amulet. With the eyes in the fortress.
Oh yes.
Again, as I say, I saw some of these when I was a youth, and I just I was not into it at all. This sort of surreal, you know, where's the guy with the sword? But there's some the Haberfield in particular, the ones that they look like late period psychedelic records, they're absolutely stunning, and you know, there's a sort of photographic, I mean, I guess it's airbrush, right? But there's a sort of photographic element to it that is so striking, it's so strange that I can't help but have those images burned into my brain. I like his the Queen of the Swords and Knight of the Swords as well, that sort of weird sort of Buddha for Ariok.
And Nicole Kidman's Builder's Bum as well.
Oh, on the Eternal Champion. Yeah, that's the one I had. And again, I at the time it just wasn't doing it for me. But just the audacity to do that on a fantasy book, like the Elric of Melniboné that we were talking about before, the Lawrence Cutting version, that just does not look like a fantasy book to me, or what I would understand a fantasy book to look like, because in my mind in the 80s they all look like Sail on the Seas of Fate or Michael Whelan's Stormbringer, or Rodney Matthews, just very sort of recognizable, this sort of elfin Elric character. I mean, I've got these, just grab the Chronicles of Corum and the Swords of Corum. At the time, I thought it was a really good idea to get these books in omnibus.
Yeah.
So this is Mark Salwowski.
Yeah, I really like that cover.
Yeah, it's very beautiful. It's very precise and it's bold. And I don't think you'd get a book cover like that now. And you wouldn't have got a book cover like that 10 years before. But just it's that absolute sort of midpoint. And it's a fantastic image of Corum there.
Yeah, I think it's the same artist that did the cover to the Chronicles of Count Brass.
It is.
Yes, that's the one. I remember at the time not being mad keen on that, but as the years have gone, I've really become more and more fond of that cover. And so it's like it's one of the guardians of the Camargue, isn't it? On a horned horse with his flame lances on his shoulders, and the Camargue's behind him, and there's an ornithopter. I think that's a really, really terrific cover. I think it's beautiful. Yeah, because it's unusual in that it doesn't feature an Eternal Champion character, unless was to think that is Hawkmoon.
Well, I presumed it was, but it bothered me that he wasn't blonde, because he talks about him as blonde. Right?
That's why, to me, it always just looked like one of the guardians of the Camargue, just kind of on patrol. But I guess it must be Hawkmoon because he's looking onto that island, and there's his missus. I'm trying to remember back to Chronicles of Castle Brass. It's alternate reality, isn't it? And is she dead? I can't remember. Anyway, we'll get to that. We'll get to the Chronicles of Castle Brass one day, because for Christ's sake, we're going to have to talk about the quest for Tanelorn. I rue the day. But yeah, so.
But are you a fan of the book Count Brass? Because I read that recently and I thought that was a really strange, interesting, sort of dreamlike. How do you follow up the history of the rune staff? You do this sort of strange thing where all your dead fellows, they're sort of alive but sort of dead at the same time, and this the whole temporal
I
thing.
remember at the time really liking Count Brass because it was so different, and I think it's Tarragorm is the main villain in that rather than Meliadus, isn't it? I remember sagging a little bit through the Champion of Garethorn, and
again, the only time he wrote at the time he only wrote a female Eternal Champion, you kind of wanted it to be better.
And I remember reading Quest for Tanelorn, and the ending just didn't buy it at all. I thought it was really I thought it was just it smacked of an author thinking, right, I'm done with all this now, let's tie it up in a neat bow and I will never speak of it again. And no, it didn't work for me. So I think my other favourite Moorcock cover, that's probably quite an unusual one, is my Breakfast in the Ruins hardcover.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Really, really like that one. It's just a little bit odd, a little bit like that.
Yeah, it's a bit René Magritte, isn't it? They're looking at surrealism.
Yeah. Does it say who the artist is? Probably not. Quite randomly, there's the Fantasy Masterworks edition of the History of the Rune Staff has got a really fantastic cover.
Oh, yeah. There's some like Dance at the End of Time series that have similar, I think the same artist, or definitely in the same vein as those.
Yeah. So once again, this is terrible for an audio medium. We're now just showing each other book covers. But anyway, back to this is going to be my final random question for you. Okay. Sure. I'm going to go out on a limb a little bit here, but sell me on Steve Hogarth Marillion.
Okay, well,
because I got Season's End back in the day for Christmas when it came out, and I put it on, and I think I listened to it once, and then I tried again about 6 months later, and I could never get over that sense of betrayal I felt that Fish was no longer part of Marillion. So whilst I'm part of that Twitter RPG nerd Marillion gang, It stops sharply just
I,
after clutching at straws.
I would have a very hard time selling anyone on Season's End.
Yeah.
Um, I greatly prefer the unmade songs that they did immediately following Clutching at Straws that have a lot of the same material that's eventually in the Season's End. And they definitely went through a rough patch of, oh God, what the fuck are we going to do? What are we trying to be? Because the album after that is Holidays in Eden, which is like they're trying to do a radio album. But I would wholeheartedly urge you to listen to Brave, and I would urge you to listen to Marbles, and I listened to a Marillion podcast and they don't like the album.com, but I think the album.com, which appropriately came out in 2000, which is when they launched the Marillion.com website.
Yeah.
There's some fantastic stuff on that. And yeah, you certainly don't go into it thinking you're going to hear a continuation of the Fish Marillion.
Yeah.
And I don't think listening to Solo Fish you're going to get a continuation of the.
No, that didn't work for me either.
No. I think Brave is an incredible album. Brave is. If you want a contentious statement, I think that's the best album Pink Floyd never made.
Interesting.
It's The Wall, but with better tunes and no misogyny. Yeah, that's a fantastic album. I'd say Marbles is a fantastic album. Give some of those. There's so many Marillion albums now, and they go up and down. The last couple have been really, really good. And Hogarth, he's an 80s guy. He loves he loves the Blue Nile, and he loves this kind of mature. They're doing sort of mature pop rather than the kind of sort of angry, spiky stuff that Fish was doing. But I guess there's a bit of a continuum, because like Clutching at Straws is a bit smoother and a bit more considered and a bit more mature. But Brave is an incredible album. Afraid of Sunlight, which is shorter, is actually probably a better album because it's a step away from sounding so much like Pink Floyd. They've done some incredible stuff, but they've done a lot, so you could easily be caught in the mire. But yes, Season's End is the first gig I ever saw was Marillion on the Season's End tour, and I absolutely loved it. But as an album, they're struggling a bit. But they became a different band. You know.
Well, I've got a small confession to make anyway, and that's that. At the time, I didn't like Misplaced Childhood or Clutching at Straws.
Oh, really? Okay.
I only grew to appreciate them a little bit later. Misplaced Childhood, I got on board with a little bit later, but there was part of me that really objected to Lavender and Kaylee, but then once I kind of get used to taking those in as part of that broad suite of music, it works.
Yeah.
Clutching at Straws, I didn't get until 10 years ago. And then I think I listened to it and the penny dropped. And I thought, I have wasted 30 years of not listening to this album. And I love it now.
Yeah. I loved that early period so much, but going back, I find myself a little embarrassed to listen to Script for Justice here, and particularly Fugazi. Now, I loved it so much. I was like, oh, this is it's so lyrical and it's so sophisticated and it's so intelligent, and it's it's exactly what you want when you're a 14-year-old or 15-year-old.
The tortured poet in all 14-year-olds loves those albums. But I unashamedly, Script for Justice Tear perhaps lesser, but I unashamedly love Fugazi still, even though I completely acknowledge how pathetic the narrator is, or the singer of those songs. That core of Fish, and just how miserable, and self-pitying he is, and particularly when it comes to stuff like She Chameleon. It's like, oh Jesus, dude, get a grip.
Why couldn't I see it at the time? But I've still got those albums. I stick them on every now and again.
I still unashamedly love it, and I will listen to it regularly, because I think a point comes where the meaning of the lyrics just kind of recedes, and the voice becomes part of the music.
Mm.
And that's where I am with those albums now. But yeah, I really do like Clutching at Straws a lot now, and it's probably, if I'm in the car and some Marillion goes on, it's usually most likely to be Clutching at Straws. So
Yeah.
but anyway, on
Well,
that,
we've covered Moorcock, we've covered role-playing games, we covered Marillion.
yeah,
I think a lot of people in the late 40s and early 50s are going to be very happy listening to this.
yeah,
And maybe everyone else has been completely...
yeah, and Rings of Power as well.
And Rings of Power, yeah.
Mm.
The show we dreamed of when we were playing MERP.
What a crazy roller coaster ride. Well, the good thing is we're coming back at some point in the next few weeks, hopefully, to talk to Guy Lawler
Yeah.
about Saga of the Manelf. So that'll be cool. Oh my God, is it Lawler or Lawley? I really feel bad now. Lawley.
I think it's Lawley.
Lawley. Sorry, Guy Lawley. And yeah, we'll get that in the bag in a couple of weeks' time, hopefully. But in the meantime, thank you, Simon Perrins, for finally coming on the show. And also tell us about your ArtStation page, your web shop, and all those other good things that people, where they can find them.
I've got an Etsy store which I keep thinking I should close because I never make any sales off it, and it just costs me every month. Like when I first put it up, I got an order within like a day, and I think, oh, I'm made, and it was like the last order I ever got.
Yeah.
So I guess if you go on my Twitter, which is HF_TF, which is a Marillion reference. And if you go to my Instagram, you'll be able to kind of find links to this stuff. But yeah, I've got art, prints and things for sale. I'll occasionally just kind of pop up and say something daft on Twitter, but I usually just listen to other people's conversations, other people's podcasts. So it's nice to contribute because I listen to your show, and I always want to interject occasionally, but I've finally got a chance to.
And if ever you want to do in the future, pick up your phone, record a voice file, and send it to me, and we'll stick it on anyway. Yeah,
absolutely.
So on that subject of web shops, I did open a Redbubble store with some merchandise with some of the commissions that I remember saying to you about 2 years ago. So yeah, when people start buying this stuff, we'll split the Redbubble profits. And then one day, someone ordered 65 quid's worth of stuff, and I was like, "Score!"
Wow!
And it was Phil. It was Phil. She bought stuff so we had cards to send to patrons.
Yeah.
And I think she bought me a water bottle with the Clint Lanley Elric on it. And I was like, oh, thanks for that. Thanks for that. But there was a tiny seed of disappointment.
Well, the option to have that stuff is always there.
Yeah.
It's not going away.
True. Right. Cool, man. Thanks again.
All right.
We will reconnect very soon.
Yeah. Well, you take care, and I'll speak to you soon.
Massive thanks to Simon, not only for joining me in Derry and Toms, but for all of his marvellous work for Breakfast in the Ruins over the last 3 years. We roamed all over the Moonbeam Roads in this one, and we'll be back soon with any luck to follow up with a chat with Guy Lawley. But in the meantime, check out Simon's ArtStation page and his Etsy store. I'll link to them in the show notes. Before we go, thanks as ever to our patrons. First, those without tier: Anthony Piconti, Sebastian Weetabix, Tim Cardos, and Dave Dempster. And to our Chaos Engineers: Andrew Slickaluna, Andrew Van Ness, Anthony Porter, Benjamin Fletcher, Dave Griffiths, Dave Voxman, Jim Kirkland, John W. Lays, Jules Lawrence, Mal Pertwee, Matt Saltz, Menyon, Nelbert, Paul McRandall, Simon Perrins, of course, Tony Milazzo, and Scott Butler. Now, Scott joined us last month, but he dropped me a line to tell me of his story with the Moonbeam Roads, and, as is customary, I'm going to read it here. And he says, I'm currently based in inner city Sydney, Australia, though increasingly I suspect I've slipped through into a parallel version of my original reality, no doubt due to the machinations of some entity of the higher spheres. I came to Michael Moorcock in my mid-teens through a random assortment of his works discovered in the local library. I was also a role player at this time, but never really connected Moorcock to RPGs until my university years, when I fell in with a group of gamers playing Stormbringer. Much of what I read of Moorcock in his early years was his more sci-fi stories, The Warlord of the Air, The Ice Schooner, etc., as well as the Jerry Cornelius novels, and a small number of Elric shorts and excerpts from the pages of Dragon magazine and the like. My first foray into Moorcock roleplay fell very much into the colour and trappings of his work, as you've referred to it. Very much power gaming in the Young Kingdoms, with very little by way of Moorcockian themes. More a bunch of late teens, early 20s roleplayers off on fantasy trips, with 3 demon swords apiece and plans to rule the million spheres. Over the years, I have uncovered bits and pieces of other series, but struggled to get my hands on complete volumes, or runs of stories. So I've read pieces of Elric, Hawkmoon, and others, but I don't ever recall stumbling across Corum or Ericos. Thanks for the podcast, as it has reawakened my interest in Michael Moorcock's work, and I'm now avidly searching for good collections. And back to the Donblass, we have new Lee Gary and, hot off the press, Mary Catherine. Thank you both so much. Lee, also known in the gaming community as CyberEdge7, said, "Mike is my favourite author, and I have a bookcase dedicated solely to his work. I started reading his books when I was 12. As for what works I hold most dear, that would be Fortress of the Pearl, The Revenge of the Rose, and The End of Time books. As for me, I'm very active in the gaming community, and I run 4 campaigns a week, which includes D&D and Shadowrun. Ariok awaits Trump." Thanks for that, Scott and Lee. It's much appreciated. We love hearing this stuff. Hands of Rill across the world, my friends, and, I might add, I sincerely hope Ariok awaits our ridiculous overlords too. And now, on to our Jugaderos. Many thanks to Alexander Harris, Ian Stead, Laws, Taylor, Matthew Broom, Toby White, Tom Murphy, Mark Hebden, Graham Holden, and Jason Connolly. And finally, eternal thanks to our patron demons, Andy Darby, Clarky the Cruel, Fred Quiche, Gareth Wilson, Imria, Janie Stim, Jay Razor, Joe Monty, Liam J, Miles Reed Labato, Mort Main, Neil Burton, Paul Hillary, Randall Gatlin, Steve Round, the OG patron Norman Beresford, Robert McMillan, and, new to the Donblass, tied to the mast and in the midst of a 1,000-year dream, Gwen Barlow. In a brief moment of waking, Gwen explained the arrival. I found the podcast through someone posting about it on the Many Worlds of Michael Moorcock Facebook group, so I'm catching up on your earliest episodes at the moment. I'm enjoying your podcast very much. I'm so happy to be listening. Big Moorcock fan, obviously, and also I've recently emigrated from Manchester to Rotterdam. So hearing you all talk about these favourites with your gorgeous Yorkshire accents is a bit of a salve for the homesickness. The first Moorcock I read was Behold the Man, which I liked well enough, but it didn't turn me into a superfan, so it was a few years before I picked up anything else. When I did, it was The Dances at the End of Time. That one instantly became one of my all-time faves. I totally fell in love with its baroque prose and decadent characters, who were such a vibrant extrapolation and exaggeration of the 1890s literary milieu the book was spun out from. So I came to the rest: Elric, Cornelius, Von Beck, a bit later still. Elric's my pick of the fantasy characters. An ex-library first edition of the Stormbringer hardcover is a pride and joy, and I'm also a huge fan of the later stuff: Mother London, Pyat, The Whispering Swarm. In terms of inspiration, the biggest influence Moorcock's had on me would be as editor of New Worlds. The ethos and attitude of his stewardship of that magazine and its writers, and the way it fused writing, genre, and contemporary pop art made such a lasting impression. It was way before my time, but I pick up the magazine format issues when and where I can. David Britton's survey of that period of the magazine, Eduardo Palazzo at New Worlds, is fantastic. And also Moorcock's non-fiction, Death is Not an Obstacle, where he breaks down his own writing methods, and Into the Media Web, a collection of essays and journalism, which is a very comprehensive literary education all by itself. Catch me in the right mood, and I'd recommend it over an English degree. All that switched me on to Savoy Books through their publication of James Cawthorne's Hawkmoon adaptation, The Golden Barge, and my experiences in the Third World War. Such a treasure. My own labour of love is writing a book for Savoy on David Britton's Lord Horror character, which is tangential to Moorcock in terms of inspiration. Right now, I'm on an Elric reread with the lovely Saga Press editions. I also found a complete run of the P. Craig Russell Stormbringer single issues in a comic shop just up the street from me here in Rotterdam a few weeks ago. Cawthorne's Stormbringer sketches coming out last year was a bit of a minor miracle, and I'm obviously very excited for the Citadel of Forgotten Myths in a couple of weeks and the Woods of Arcady next year. I'm listening to the stuff he recorded 3 years ago now, but I really like you and Loz's humour talking through the Dreaming City. I was fully gone over the deadpan 6 blokes sat around a fire waiting for a mysterious 7th bloke, and I really appreciated you and Natasha going into such depth on the Jewel of the Skull, especially taking in the historical context of when it was written, thinking about the historical currents swirling around the zeitgeist at the time, as well as what might have been informing Moorcock's own political position as an anarchist, particularly when it comes to the anti-imperialist themes. I loved Natasha's observations about the compassionate writing of the monsters and their suffering at the hands of heroic adventure characters like Count Brass. A really astute and important point about this kind of fantasy, which is probably lacking in more recent iterations of the genre. I very much value your perspective on fantasy being more informed by Robert E. Howard than the 1,000-page tomes. I share your affection for him too, and greatly prefer shorter and more condensed melodramas to the wordy epics that just go on a bit when it comes to fantasy. It's such an overall comprehensive and thoughtful engagement with Moorcock's work at the same time as keeping a healthy irreverence shaped by love for the material rather than cynicism. Really cosy listening. This is becoming podcast length in its own right. Hope it isn't too much. Keep on keeping on with the good stuff. That is amazing feedback, Gwen. Thank you. I can only hope we keep up with expectations as you work your way through what is now probably over 70 hours of gabbing. On the subject of Natasha, we've been trying to hook up again, but diaries just haven't been kind. And now she's upping and moving to the far end of the country. Well, the Midlands. So the middle of the country, sort of. Far enough away, anyway. That said, I'm taking her for dinner later to say farewell, so she'll owe me some virtual Derry and Toms action once she's settled into her new surroundings. Over on Podbean, Chris Neely left a comment on our Night of the Swords Book 3 episode. Chris said, "Revisiting this episode on Thanksgiving here in America, winding down with a good belly laugh about salty rhubarb and hedonistic chaos playing with random genocide. For these random terrible things, I must say I'm thankful to ponder on the moonbeam roads as I visualise Hieronymus Bosch dropping acid while thumbing a few pages of the multiverse. You madmen, I love you beyond the laws of physics." Well, thank you, Chris, for all of your love over recent months on the Podbean platform, and I hope you and all of our friends across the pond had a peaceful and satisfying Thanksgiving. We've had some specific feedback on our Halloween special too over on YouTube, courtesy of Tetsucat, but I'll save that for the new year when we're going to have a little follow-up where we're going to look at some very uncosy catastrophes. Coming up very soon though, it will be December, and time for our 4th Christmas/birthday show. Amazing how the years are flying by. And for this year's special, we've decided to restore an old UK tradition, ghost stories for Christmas. So, we put 4 spooky stories to the patrons, and they chose The Devils of D-Day by Graham Masterton. It narrowly beat out The Ghost Pirates by William Hope Hodgson, and both have been distant runners-up in previous Halloween polls, so it feels about right that they will finally get their due. Therefore, we'll cover The Devils of D-Day, and then, if we don't overdose on port and snowballs over the festive period, we'll bang out The Ghost Pirates as a quick follow-up for New Year's Eve. No promises on that though, as we will drink a lot of port, snowballs, Malibu and Coke, and McEwen's Export, and I'll probably eat my own body weight in cheese footballs and struggle to get off the sofa. Right, enough yakking. Don't forget you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram with the handle @BreakfastRuins. You can email us at breakfastruins@outlook.com. The webpage is breakfastintheruins.com. You can listen to Breakfast in the Ruins radio via the internet, most easily via Radio Garden via either app or browser. Just search BITR Breakfast in the Ruins or look at the Bradford UK blob on the Radio Garden map. We have our Patreon page too, and there are a few extra odds and sods on there. And finally, we'll have to wait until the next life, sadly, for Kevin O'Neill's take on Londra, as he passed away following the recording of this episode. He was a giant in the British comics scene and a massive influence on my young brain back in the 80s. R.I.P. Kev. So that's it for now. We'll be back soon to celebrate birthdays and the festive season with the Devils of D-Day. But in the meantime, take care, stay safe, and we will meet again soon. on the Moonbeam Roads.